So this beautiful man, Quentin Tarantino, he has abandoned the Movie Critic as his final film. So the Movie Critic was announced, that was the title of the movie, that was going to be his final film. And Deadline reports that he, quote, simply changed his mind, end quote. Which is interesting, and I'm going to talk about why that's interesting. Because this really shouldn't be a big story, but it is for reasons I'll get into. But going back a little bit, so what is, or should I say was, the Movie Critic? So it was going to be Tarantino's last film. It was going to be set in the late 70s in California, and it would follow the titular Movie Critic, who was based off of a movie reviewer that Tarantino grew up reading, who would write movie reviews for like a porno magazine. He described the guy as a, quote, early Howard Stern and what Travis Bickle, which was Robert De Niro's character in Taxi Driver. It's early Howard Stern and what Travis Bickle might be if he were a film critic, end quote. So this kind of like sleazy kind of film critic guy. Brad Pitt would have starred. There were rumors that actors from many of Tarantino's past films would show up. There was also rumors that Brad Pitt would not only be in the film, but he would be reprising the role he played in Tarantino's last film, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. But this seems to no longer be happening, or at least for the time being. And there is precedent for Tarantino canceling a planned film. So Deadline notes that Tarantino had canceled The Hateful Eight, which was his 8th film that came out I was a freshman, so 2015. He canceled The Hateful Eight after the script was leaked online. But it was resurrected after a staged reading of the script for charity was well received by attendees and critics and stuff like that. So there is precedent of him canceling stuff, but in that case, it got uncanceled. And he's also had some other projects that never really worked out. So the Hollywood Reporter notes that he worked on an idea like I don't know how far it got. I don't know if a script was written, but he was working on an R-rated Star Trek film for Paramount that never materialized, right? But this really shouldn't be that big of a deal that a film that we didn't really know much about is getting canceled. But the reason why this is a big deal, and the reason why I'm talking about this, is because this all has to do with Tarantino's self-imposed 10-film rule. So Tarantino feels that directors never make their best movies in their later period, in the later periods of their career. And they don't do that to make their best films, but oftentimes their worst films happen at that point. We have a quote from him here. I think this was like talking to... may have been Playboy, actually. In 2012, he said, quote, I want to stop at a certain point. Directors don't get better as they get older. Usually the worst films in their filmography are those last 4 at the end. I am all about my filmography, and one bad film fucks up 3 good ones. I don't want that bad, out-of-touch comedy in my filmography, the movie that makes people think, oh man, he still thinks it's 20 years ago. When directors get out of date, it's not pretty, end quote. And look, who am I to argue with Tarantino, quite possibly the biggest film history nerd to ever exist, let alone become a director. But I just fundamentally disagree with this analysis. And maybe I don't know enough directors and stuff, and maybe that's true, but I don't know if that's necessarily true as a blanket statement, because like I just pulled up a few directors, and I know unfortunately they are all white men, right? But I think just as a good example, because these are prolific creators, right? If these directors had followed that film, that rule, we would have lost out on some incredible films. So, like, for example, if Spielberg followed this rule, his last film would have been Empire of the Sun. So we never would have gotten Schindler's List or Jurassic Park or Saving Private Ryan or essentially anything in that he did in the 90s or forward. If Scorsese followed this rule, his last film would be The Color of Money. So we wouldn't have gotten Goodfellas or Casino or The Departed or The Irishman or Silence or The Killers of the Flower Moon. This makes no sense. Especially in a year where Killers of the Flower Moon, like, I think that's one of Scorsese's best films ever. And that's his, like, 30th something film, or however many films the guy's made. Kubrick, right? Someone that, this is not a modern guy. This is something that Tarantino was definitely growing up with. Kubrick only made, like, 13 films, or whatever. But if Kubrick followed this rule, his last film would have been Barry Lyndon. So we never would have gotten The Shining, Full Metal Jacket, or Eyes Wide Shut. Those are like some of the best films ever made. And I think they did some kind of like directors roundtable. I forget who it was. It was like Quentin Tarantino. James Cameron was there, and Tarantino was talking about this. And James Cameron basically spoke up and he was like, I feel the exact opposite. Like, I want to die with the camera in my hands. Like, I never want to stop directing and making movies. And I think this is just a really weird again, self-imposed rule, because I think it also just assumes that directors are, they come out of the gate the best they're going to be, and it only goes downhill from there. I just fundamentally disagree. And I think just human beings in any facet, but especially in a creative thing like this, in a creative field like filmmaking, directors need time to develop their voice, right? So just because a movie isn't as good as, like, it might be rough around the edges, but it might be, the film that director needs to make in order to make this masterpiece 15 years from now, right? So I just fundamentally disagree with Tarantino about this. But, it doesn't mean he would stop working necessarily. He says that maybe he would work on, like, a limited series or even plays. He has, like, become kind of like a novelist. He created, like, a novel adaptation of his own film, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. He's written some nonfiction kind of like film criticism books. But we want to see the man make movies. And I'm not alone in thinking this is dumb. So The Independent ran an article by Louis Chilton titled "Quentin Tarantino's 10-film rule is pointless and will ultimately damage his legacy," end quote. And there's a great quote from that article, and I think it sums up the whole thesis, which is, quote, "In trying to curate his own legacy, he may well end up souring it," end quote. Because again, I think he's trying to micromanage his legacy. And he's looking at film history, and his analysis is, well, all these directors, they stop making good movies after like their 10th film or whatever. Yeah, but if they had stopped, maybe their trajectory would have. I don't even know how to explain it, but it's like you can't write that future for yourself, right? I think just ditch your dumb rule. I don't know how I'm getting so angry about this, but it's just so dumb. Like, it just creates more problems for you, because when you make a film your final film, and like everyone knows it's your final film, it's given way more importance than it may need or deserve, right? So the Movie Critic probably would have been really great, but the pressure to make it his best can create problems, because he's not just saying I want to make 10 films. Like, he wants his last film to be his best film. So this is an example of like the perfect being the enemy of the good, right? Where because of that pressure, what probably would have been like a great movie and one of the best movies of the decade is just now not going to exist, because it doesn't fit his vision of what he wants to go out on, right? But if it's like, okay, you make this movie, and if it's not the best movie you've ever made, well, you're still going to make another movie, right? I think, again, the number 10 itself is just arbitrary, right? Like, why 10? Like, why isn't it 13? Like, if you really want to do it, like, make a spreadsheet and do an analysis and figure out, okay, what actually would that number be? I personally feel like you should just keep making films until you run out of things to say, right? If you really love film as much as you do, and as much as I know you do, Quentin, that, film is not something you can choose not to do. It is something that it's like breathing. You just have to do it. But ultimately, he might change his mind. Right? People have been known to do this. Hollywood Reporter noted that, someone like Stephen King announced his retirement in 2022. 2002. And he's written 26 novels since then. So, people say this stuff, but again, I think Tarantino loves this so much, that, I think he's just gonna pull this out. He's gonna ditch this rule, hopefully. JJ Because commented, "Praise the Lord, this movie would have been a disaster. Opens the door to something far more interesting for his final film." I agree, right? Even though I had said it probably would have been a really great film, I was never super hot on the premise. And to be fair, I was not a huge fan of Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. I found it very meandering and aimless. And maybe that was the point, but it just didn't really work for me. As Scorsese would say, he's like, movies aren't good or bad. It's just it works for you or it doesn't work for you. But I kind of agree to your point where I was never super compelled by the premise. So I think this could, again, maybe I'm all wrong, and maybe he will rise to the challenge and make his last film the best film, and this will really light a fire under his ass. But again, I just think it's really dumb to limit yourself, because you don't know, your 11th film might be your best film. I don't know, but maybe that's just me. I'm getting like sweaty. I'm getting all worked up about this. So why don't we move on?